Welcome everybody. My name is Peter Matheson. I'm the principal of the University of Edinburgh. So thank you very much for joining us wherever you are. It's my pleasure to be the first to welcome you. You will have seen the format of the event, and I'll pass over in a second to my colleague, Professor Rowena Arshad, who's going to run the event and formally introduce the speaker. As many of you will know, this is a lecture named after Professor David Raife, who was Professor of Sociology of Education for a number of years here in Edinburgh, and then retired and sadly and unexpectedly died soon after retirement, as long ago as February 2015. So that was before I joined the university, and I never had the pleasure of meeting David Raife, but I've heard lots of very good things about him. This lecture is named in his honor, and this is the third in the series. And I noticed that we've got at least one of the previous speakers on the call. But this evening's speaker, we're very pleased to welcome to the University of Edinburgh, Lord Jack McConnell of Glens Corriedale. The title tells you a little bit about where he grew up and went to school, because those of you will know that Glens Corriedale is a location on the Isle of Arran. Jack was the youngest First Minister of Scotland when elected, and he served in that role from 2001 to 7, and still remains to this day the youngest person to serve as First Minister in any of the UK nations. He grew up on a sheep farm on the Isle of Arran and was a high school mathematics teacher for a decade before moving into full-time politics. I won't read out the list of his current roles, except to say that he's retired in inverted commas, because he sounds pretty busy to me from the list of activities which he undertakes. He and I have met on at least one occasion at an event. We were just trying to remember where it was. He is a graduate of the University of Stirling and is now the Chancellor of the University of Stirling. And he has a number of active roles in relation to sustainability, peace, and global events. So, Jack, we know you're a busy man. Thank you very much for making the time to be with us this evening. Thank you to everybody for joining. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Rowena to conduct the event. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Principal Matheson, and welcome to everyone. As the Principal has said, this is the third David Raife Memorial Lecture, and we're delighted that Lord McConnell will be giving the lecture this evening. I would like to also extend a very warm welcome to all members of the Raife family who are able to join us for this lecture. However, before inviting Lord McConnell to speak, I want to say something about David's work. Now, David contributed vastly, so please allow me about 5 minutes to share some of his thinking with you as a prelude to today's lecture. I'm very grateful to his two close colleagues, Drs. Cathy Howison and Linda Croxford from the Centre for Educational Sociology, for reminding me of some of the key issues which David wrote about and cared about. David studied the major curriculum and qualification reforms in Scotland for more than 3 decades. He argued for the need for a clear and shared vision of the aims of a reform and the values it hoped to realise. Crucially, this needed to go beyond a general statement of principles. He found the Curriculum for Excellence 4 capacities and 7 principles, while laudable, to be too vague and too divorced from practice. Its model of innovation, prioritising local development, whereby teachers and schools identify and respond to the needs of their pupils and community, and having the power to make disaggregated decisions is important. However, schools largely do not have a system-wide perspective, and therefore cannot understand the consequences of their particular decisions on a national system. So we want to maintain a highly devolved structure and give power to teachers to innovate and implement reform. Then David would have argued there would be an even greater need for a clear and agreed vision of the whole. Another issue I think that David highlighted is the need for realism. Reforms need to start from a recognition and analysis of the selective function of education and to work within its constraints. The decision to develop the curriculum without the pressure of a national examination meant that the Curriculum for Excellence in reality became a curriculum for 3 to 15, with a senior phase as an afterthought, and its relationship with Broad General Education, BGE, unclear and problematic. For David, a realistic approach would have been to recognize the influence of national examinations and then work to avoid their constraining effects and to consider how they might be designed to promote curricular goals. He would argue that while education cannot compensate for society, it can still make a difference. David was also concerned about the different patterns of provision under Curriculum for Excellence that ran the risk of increasing social stratification and inequalities. He argued that a degree of uniformity has contributed to some of the strengths of the Scottish system, comparatively low levels of social segregation in schools and across schools, consistency of standards, mutual learning, and a system that is transparent to users and public. He did not reject the idea of diversity, rather that we need to carefully consider the appropriate balance between uniformity and diversity, and to set out clear and agreed principles for diversity. A successful education system needs to be able to scrutinize its performance and to examine policy processes and their impacts. David, in one of his last pieces of writing, highlighted the inability of Scotland to do so because it now lacks regular system-wide longitudinal data and an independent research capacity able to use such data. A source of frustration for David was that the culture of innovation would appear to make policymakers unwilling to recognise continuities with the past. He would therefore be delighted that Lord McConnell is taking this opportunity to revisit past policy and to consider the way ahead for Scottish education. Can I ask, if you have questions for Lord McConnell during the Q&A session, that you use the chat box, and I will monitor this alongside Kathy and Linda, my colleagues, as the lecture progresses. Principal Matheson has already introduced Lord McConnell, so I don't think I need much further introduction, other than to say that his first post was in Lawrence Hill Academy in Alloa, for those of you who might be interested, and also to say I'm dead proud that he's a graduate of the University of Stirling, a fine university. My daughter is a graduate of Stirling as well. So, but it's also important to say that it was during your time, Lord McConnell, that the policy for the Curriculum for Excellence was established, though not necessarily implemented till 2010. I could go on, but I think your breadth of experience, your roots in education, your commitment to social justice and young people make you a superb choice for today's lecture. Lord McConnell.
Thank you very much indeed. It is such a pity that we are not tonight together, appreciating the opportunity to discuss education face to face. But 2020 has been a strange and difficult year, and I'm delighted. I think this is perhaps the third attempt we've had to organise a day and time for the lecture and make it happen, and I'm absolutely delighted that we are now here and we have an opportunity to reflect on excellence in this Scottish education system. I want to thank, obviously, Murray House School of Education and Sport and Edinburgh University for the honour of delivering this lecture this evening. I have many memories of Murray House. My first experiences of Murray House were as a student union office bearer, going into Murray House to debate with what were then by far the most left-wing activists in the student movement in Scotland, and being challenged by them back in the late 70s and early 80s was very good practice for me for the First Minister's questions that would come a very long time afterwards. I have a more pleasant memory in more recent times when I was able to attend a graduation ceremony where my son graduated from Murray House to become an English teacher just about 15 years ago. That, I think, was probably the last time that I attended an event at Murray House, so I'm delighted to be back. I want to thank Rowena and Peter for their introductions, but particularly thank Kathy Howison for her invitation to deliver this lecture and for the work that she and the whole team have put into making it happen this evening. Originally, when I agreed to deliver this lecture, I had visions of having some slides up on a screen and enjoying a reception afterwards. But tonight, I don't want to use any slides, and I actually don't really want to use any statistics either, because all of the statistics that I'm going to refer to in broad terms are easily available, whether it's through the academic work of researchers and teachers at Murray House in Edinburgh, or whether it's from Stirling or from any of the other institutions. And I want to concentrate tonight more on analysis and opinions. And I want to reflect back on why we are where we are, and what we might want to do about it. I'm not going to talk at great length about 2020. There's been enough debate, even again this week, about the impact of COVID-19 on our education system. Suffice to say that I think what has happened this year has exposed weaknesses in our system that bring even more urgency to the need to address those weaknesses, both in governance and in delivery. And I hope tonight I can say what I'm going to say in as non-partisan way as possible. I think we have a dreadful us and them approach to debate in Scottish politics these days, where any comment made by anybody on any side is immediately interpreted by others to be supporting or not supporting particular constitutional positions. Tonight I'm talking about education, and I hope that what I say can be accepted as genuine in relation to education and the opportunity that we have in Scotland to make our own decisions on that, but also the responsibility we have to make the right decisions. I want to focus tonight primarily on schools, not on preschool or on further or higher education, although I try to never forget that we have to see the system as a whole. As well as thanking the organisers of tonight's event, I want to thank teachers. I think teaching, I've always thought this, since I was in primary 3 and I told my primary school teacher I wanted to be a sums teacher someday. I've always thought teaching was the most important job of all. The opportunity to share knowledge, to be a role model for those in front of you in the classroom, to keep records, because that matters years later, and to raise aspiration. That opportunity is almost unique, and it's very, very special. And I admire and respect the job that teachers do every day. Teaching is a uniquely difficult, but also a uniquely fulfilling occupation, it's a vocation. And I think we should never forget to thank those who do it on our behalf. I also want to thank David Rafe, I suppose tonight through the family members that are present. He left an incredible legacy of research and analysis that stands the test of time. But I have been struck in preparing for this lecture in the fact that that legacy goes far beyond what was written. He has clearly inspired generations of researchers and academics and educationalists to look for more solutions, for better joined up policy and delivery, for analysis that really makes a difference. And that is an incredible legacy for someone to leave behind. I enjoyed at university my classes on the sociology of education more than any others. And as director of the Centre for Educational Sociology, David used that subject to make a real difference in education in Scotland and far beyond. And he's not here anymore, but I congratulate him on that. And I hope that the legacies left behind will encourage us to be honest and demanding in our analysis of education in Scotland today and in the future. From an educational point of view, I was very fortunate. I was encouraged and supported by my family. I spotted when I was very young that the way of me and I was never born to be a farmer. The way for me to not be a shepherd like my dad and to get out of there and do something else with my life, the way to do that was to work hard at school. I'm not sure I maintained that all the way through my school life, but in the early years, I certainly had that ambition. I had excellent teachers at primary and secondary, outstanding teachers, particularly in the primary school. And one of them in particular offered words of encouragement and to some extent discipline to me when I left primary school that stayed with me I've stayed with me all my life, and in many ways perhaps led to some of the positions I've held down through the decades. I benefited from comprehensive education in the 1970s. I was in the first year in the Isle of Arran where people could stay and conduct all their certificates on the island. And in the late 70s, I benefited from attending a fantastic new university that was small but had innovation and real values at its core. But I then experienced the real challenges that followed in the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 1980s, as a teacher, trying to implement what were known as the Munning-Dunning reforms, the new standard grades and everything that went with them in the classroom, experiencing the devastating impact of the industrial action, which I think to this day still has an impact in Scotland. And then the impact in primary schools of the introduction of national tests, which were equally, I think, controversial and I think soured the debate on assessment in Scotland for far too long afterwards. And then as a parent in the 1990s, experiencing the drop in morale in schools, the decline in discipline, the challenges of the state of the buildings and the state of the curriculum, and learning from that we really needed to use devolution to change. And throughout the 80s and 90s, as an adult, I had been campaigning for devolution for many reasons. But one of those key reasons was that I believed that the distinctive Scottish education system should be controlled and accountable in Scotland, not at Westminster. I campaigned for devolution in 1979, but I was even then unhappy that universities were not included in the proposed Scottish Assembly's remit, and helped ensure that by the 1990s, the whole Scottish education system would be part of any new Scottish Parliament's responsibilities. Some people wanted devolution to protect Scottish education, and that language is still occasionally used today. But I wanted devolution to improve Scottish education. I believe that if we could make the system more accountable, more responsible to the people of Scotland, then we could instill more ambition and a greater sense of achievement and aspiration into the education system from top to bottom. So I didn't just want to stop decline, I wanted to reverse decline. And I saw a Scottish Parliament and a devolved Scottish Government as a way of achieving that. When I became Education Minister in 2000, 20 years ago this month, it was first of all a remarkable honour. I actually argued with Henry McLeish, the then First Minister, not to appoint me. But there were other reasons for that. And when I left the meeting with him, I think it was a Friday evening, I remember punching the air with delight as I got back into my car and drove away. It was the job that I had dreamed of, even if it was the most difficult job in the government at that time. We had just had the debacle of the national examinations and the Scottish Qualifications Agency sending out wrong results, in some cases no results, to pupils and students across Scotland. Morale in the teaching profession was probably at an all-time low. Our buildings were falling apart, and getting ambition back into the system seemed like an almost impossible task. But in mentioning some of the things that we did then, I hope that there are perhaps lessons to be learned today. With the SQA, for example, the first thing that had to be done was to stop the body being governed by a representative group of people who were there to represent their own vested interests, rather than there to serve the whole and deliver the best possible examination system. Changed that, and it made a huge difference. The inspectorate had become far too close to government and far too close to policy making, and making them an independent agency again made a huge difference to the quality of their work and their ability to help drive improvement through the system. The teachers' settlement not only helped improve morale, but it created a new professionalism for the 21st century across teaching in a way that seemed to me at the time, I mean, I remember as a teacher in the 80s thinking much of this was wrong, seemed to me at the time to be long overdue. The fact that teachers were one of the few professions that hadn't had continuous professional development, or that teaching was one of the few professions where it was virtually a job for life and you would never be in any way disciplined for poor performance or bad behaviour. These things being tackled after all this time, alongside significant changes to head teacher qualifications, to teacher training, ITE, made a huge difference. And then specific initiatives, music tuition in primary schools, environmental and global education across all primary and secondary schools, and then the building programme. All of these different initiatives joined together to provide a foundation for improvement and for ambition. And we built on that between 2003 and 2007 with the introduction of Schools of Ambition, which were an attempt within the Scottish comprehensive system, not to split up the comprehensive system, but to encourage and support innovation and freedom for head teachers to serve their communities better and raise the aspirations and achievements of their pupils. Cross-sector work improved, and we invested a lot in colleges and universities to ensure that the pathways were there beyond the school system for what we hoped were improvements in pupil achievement to then result in even better destinations afterwards. And of course, we were also trying to introduce proper rights for children with special needs and their parents, and for those children who had experience of the care system. When I reached 2007 and an assessment of where we should go from there, we had, of course, at that point, had the national conversation on education and made the in-principle decisions about the values that would underpin curriculum for excellence. But I vividly remember in the autumn of 2006, just before Peter Peacock had his operation and had to stand down as Education Secretary, discussing with Peter our worries at that time that curriculum for excellence was not going to, in the way it was developing, achieve the ambitions that we had set out at the beginning. Become slightly detached from the aspirations that we wanted it to achieve. We were looking to stretch people at the top of the system and to raise achievement and aspiration for those who were being left behind. We wanted to see more innovation for head teachers and for teachers in their individual classrooms. But we also wanted to see a greater focus on some very basic elements of knowledge, numeracy in particular. And we were aware that internationally, Scotland was starting to fall behind, and therefore we needed this major reform to catch up. And we resolved at that point and said at the time that if we were re-elected in 2007, we would review the way in which curriculum for excellence was developing, and there would be significant changes. But when it came to 2007 itself, and I was leaving office, my last experience of a school gave me a very stark reminder of the need to always remember where pupils are coming from if we're going to have high quality education, or even in any way to have a connection with them. I attended the opening of the new William Wood High School in East Renfrewshire just before the 2007 election, my last official engagement. And we had a fabulous ceremony where there were pupils conducting themselves perfectly on the stage, and local parents involved, local dignitaries, of course, and teachers and the head teacher. Everything had gone well. Even the little curtain had easily come off the plaque we had a successful event, and afterwards I went down to the head teacher's study to do a recorded interview, I think with Radio Clyde. And there was a young boy sitting outside the head teacher's room, as there is in every school in the world, in my experience. There's always somebody sitting outside the head teacher's room waiting for a meeting with the head teacher. And so I guessed right away this little boy was in a bit of trouble. And on a bit of a high from the event itself, I stopped and spoke to him and asked him why he was there that day. And he stuck his head sort of down in his chest and mumbled something at me. And I thought, right, okay, I'm going to press the point here. Things are going well today, and he needs to learn a bit of a lesson, perhaps. So I got my teacher's hat on and said, "Have you been in trouble? Are you waiting for the head teacher because you've been in trouble?" And he said, Yes, I've been in trouble. I have been. And I thought, right, what can I say to this little boy that would perhaps, give him a bit of a shock? Obviously, I wasn't a teacher anymore, so I couldn't give him any kind of proper punishment. But what I could do perhaps was say something else. And on the spur of the moment, I said, "Do you realise that I'm in charge of all the prisons in Scotland?" And he looked up at me with really bright eyes and said, "You'll have met my big brother, Robert, then." And I remembered that day, never to take anything for granted when you're dealing with pupils in the classroom. And we weren't taking things for granted by that point. We knew that Curriculum for Excellence was going to be important. We knew that there was an emerging problem with the process of developing the detail. And we knew there had to be some changes. So alongside all of the other things that we talked about back then, for the next phase in our educational improvement programme, reviewing Curriculum for Excellence would have been absolutely central. And I've been frustrated ever since, really, I have to say. I think there were three big mistakes made in the years that followed. The first was the agreement with the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities and the Scottish Government that led to the freezing of the council tax. When all of the money for special initiatives that had tried to drive change and lead change nationally was wrapped up in a settlement with local government to give every local council in Scotland more freedom over their expenditure and in return for them freezing the council tax. And I think the impact of that was, but maybe an unseen impact at the time by new ministers who were maybe a little bit naive about this, I don't know, but they didn't see it. The impact of that would be that it would reduce the levers they had to drive improvement, particularly in a system where with 32 local authorities, there is so much diversity in size and scale and capacity and quality that government at a national level needs to have those levers to make change happen. The second thing I think was a big mistake was to abolish some of the measurements or withdraw from some of the comparators that Scotland was at that time measuring. And we had not been immune from that mistake ourselves in government in the years previously. But it was taken on to a new level, I think, at that point. And if we're going to have major radical changes or significant reforms in Scottish education, we need to be able to see year on year, over long periods of time, how those changes impact on attainment, aspiration, and outcome. And I think reducing the amount of data that was available, as I think Rowena and others have already mentioned, and comparative data in particular, long-term comparative data, I think was a big mistake, and we're paying a price for that today. And then the third thing I think was to, I was going to say accelerate, but it was a pretty slow acceleration. But to continue the direction of travel on Curriculum for Excellence, a direction that I think has led directly, in my view, to the lack of success in reducing the attainment gap, the low morale in many schools today, and the declining standards for Scotland in comparison internationally. I was very struck by a recent report by Reform Scotland that said that the schools which perform best in Scotland at the moment are those that have largely ignored the 20,000 pages of guidance on curriculum for excellence. And the very fact that an official report can even, or an unofficial report, some people might say, can even claim that, should be a deep worry to everybody involved at the top of Scottish education and in every local authority and school in the country. I think, unfortunately, the combination of curriculum for excellence and the new national qualifications has led to a reduction in the achievements, particularly for those pupils from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. The number of authorities who offer less qualifications to senior pupils now, or the number of pupils who I am absolutely certain are achieving less as they work towards their qualifications at the end of S4, I think is stark in Scotland today, and it should upset and anger all of us who care deeply about what we are achieving. I think the fact that schools are largely getting on with business without the strength of a clear definition on curriculum and the knowledge that they should be imparting is a credit to the schools, but it should make us question the curriculum that they've been asked to follow. And I do think there has been in the bureaucracy and and to some extent in the governance of Scottish education over these years, most recent years, almost an embedding of complacency and stability, rather than the desire for improvement and higher aspirations that have been there before. And as I think Walter Humes has written about recently, the state of governance in Scottish education, with the range of boards and committees and councils, and the way in which the same people move around them, and the way in which those people, who are all, I'm sure, fine individuals, end up representing particular interests rather than driving change across the system as a whole, I think makes further change and a radical shake-up really quite difficult indeed. But I want to try and spark off a bit of a debate by setting out 5 things that I think are absolutely needed in 2021. We're about to have, hopefully, some significant national debates about the way in which we recover from 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic experience. We're about, hopefully, to have some debate about future policy in the Scottish Parliament between the political parties. And I don't make these points in a partisan way, because I think all the parties have been guilty over recent years of accepting the situation without really challenging it enough. And I want to make 5 specific proposals that hopefully will then spark off some discussion afterwards. The first is, I think there's a desperate need to stop clarifying curriculum for excellence and to radically shake it up. We need to put knowledge, attainment, and I think in particular the freedom to innovate at the centre of the curriculum. And we need to make sure that there is an absolute link between that and the national qualifications that are in place. And many people I've spoken to in preparing for this lecture have said to me that it might just be too difficult to radically shake up the system, that it's spent so much time and effort has been spent in delivering this new system or putting it in place. So much time and effort has been used to embed it across Scottish education that turning it around might just be too difficult. But I think if we know that something is not working, we have an absolute duty to those who are currently in Scottish schools or who may come into them in the future, to accept that radical action is required, and to start down that road as quickly as possible. The second thing I think we need is to recognise that education in Scotland is not working. And there has to be a standalone inspectorate that is responsible for, yes, not only inspecting schools, but driving improvements, and where necessary, highlighting failures, and commenting independently on that, separately from government intervention. The third thing I think is required is a significant review of the teaching settlement, what was called at the time, I think, the settlement for the 21st century teaching profession. Many of the basics of that are, will stand the test of time, but surely 20 years on, we need to look back and say, are we getting this right? Have we got in 2020 for the year 2030 or the year 2040, have we got continuous professional development right? Do teachers have the skills now, not just for this year, but for 5 years and 10 years from now? We need to, I think, look at both local authority and school management in relation to the contract and the settlement. Have local authorities, have all of the local authorities, all 32 of them, have they been good enough at driving change through this new contract? Or have they been restricted by the new contract, and which of course is no longer new? But I think 20 years on, I need to review that as essential. And all of my anecdotal experience talking to teachers and others in recent times would indicate to me that there is a problem with recruitment and retention in Scottish schools. So we need, I think, also to be reviewing the way in which the settlement has impacted on recruitment and retention in more recent times. The fourth thing that I would address is, we've been told is a top priority for the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, and I absolutely welcome the fact that the current First Minister has made this much more of a priority than her predecessor. The need for us to improve the life chances of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable children in our country, particularly those who've had a connection with the care system, is obvious to anybody who studies any of the statistics or any of the impacts on these children and young people that are now well documented. It is simply unacceptable that such a high proportion of our young people fail so dramatically in comparison to their peers. And we need to have a comprehensive attack on this failure. We need mentors, we need tutors, we need facilities in which these children and young people can carry on their schoolwork outside of school in the same way as many children and young people from homes where they have better chances can do. We need the same access to out of school, out of classroom activities. That sometimes needs materials. It sometimes just needs clothing. But these children and young people should have those opportunities too. And critically, as we've learned in 2020, they need access to technology and support in using it in the same way as, I guess, those parents or grandparents who are on this call this evening ensure is available for their children and their grandchildren. And that needs concerted, targeted action, willing to accept ideas from wherever they come and then implement them consistently and ruthlessly to make sure that these children have a better chance in life. And then fifthly, and finally, we need to get back on course with statistics and with data and measurement. We need to be able to measure and compare not only how Scotland is doing internationally, but also how Scotland is doing with our neighbours inside the United Kingdom in comparison with them. And we need to be able to compare past, present and future policy and initiatives in Scotland itself. So that needs a a renewed, a fresh commitment to the independent collection of accurate data and research, and then the consistent collection of that over a period of time against proper baselines that can then be used to analyse progress or decline and take either corrective action or build upon that which is working. So I think in these 5 areas, we need urgent action from whoever is in the Scottish Government, whoever is the Minister, whoever leads not just the government, but the key educational bodies in Scotland and our 32 local authorities. I believe that if urgent action is taken, we can make a difference. But I believe if we keep putting it off, then children and young people in Scotland will pay a terrible price. I think the time for piecemeal change, for complacency, and to some extent for political spin has come and gone. You know, this can't be tolerated anymore in relation to our education service. It really is time for honesty and for action. The children and young people, not just in Scotland, but in countries all over the world, have had a terrible 2020. It's had an incredible impact on their mental health, their physical health, and it will have a terrible impact on the educational achievement, I believe, of a significant number of these young people too. So I think we need to resolve to give them some hope from 2021. And in Scotland, aspiring to have an education system that could be a world leader again, the way we used to be, would be a very good place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord McConnell. I think you've covered a range of topics there, and you've thrown the gauntlet down for a discussion for this evening with your 5 areas. So I'm going to invite people to actually start posting questions on the chat, which would be really helpful. But I'd like to maybe kick off by asking you this thing about improving the life chances of the most vulnerable, and this tension between that and also the selective function of education. And I wondered, how far can an education system be designed in a fair, equitable, and educational way as well? So meeting these range of needs of having knowledge, assessment, depth, and disciplinary knowledge, as well as improving life chances, and then looking at the broader curriculum as well. I mean, there's just so much. Where would you start?
Where would I start? Well, I think there's 3 things I would like to say about that. The first, and for many on the call tonight, I think it will be obvious, but I'll make the point anyway. The only way to really significantly change the life chances of the most disadvantaged, the most vulnerable children and young people in Scotland is to allocate a degree of priority to that that is way beyond even what we were doing, I think. And I think we were doing, you know, we were making it a big priority back in my day, but even back then, way beyond that. But then to consistently apply that over decades, not over months or a couple of years, because particularly for these children and young people, consistency and predictability are really, really important. So the first point, and maybe an obvious point, but I think that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is about the curriculum. While I believe very strongly that we need to get basic knowledge more deeply embedded in the curriculum than it has been under Curriculum for Excellence, I also believe that in the modern world, the teaching of life skills in schools has become very important, and from on everything from financial management to some of the social skills and softer skills that people need to deal with the world of work today. I think in these and other areas, I think we need to. There are some very good examples of that in Scottish schools, but we need to, I think, make it clear that we expect that to be happening everywhere. And then thirdly, I think we need to recognise that while schools are at the centre of their communities and absolutely vital to the lives of children and to parents as well, that they don't exist in a vacuum. And unless we have proper joined up thinking between schools and other public and services and voluntary services as well, then we're not going to deal with those children that are most at risk or furthest behind. And so therefore, I think there is a real need to have a much more joined up approach that doesn't see schools as separate from what is happening elsewhere. And I think schools suffer from the way in which social services in particular are currently struggling to deal with the changes in society and in families, and keep pace and help children that are most at risk. And again, that's not unique to Scotland. It's a significant problem in England as well. I think some of the work that's been done by the Children's Commissioner in England and Longfield, I think, is really impressive on this. So I think now and again in Scotland, we maybe, well, there's always lots that we can teach everybody else. Sometimes we can look for good work elsewhere, and it would be good to perhaps look at some of the work that she's doing, because I think it is trying to address that issue of different parts of the public and voluntary sector joining up their thinking and actually acting together.
Thank you very much, Jack. I mean, certainly you mentioned at the beginning that you were concentrating on school as opposed to post-compulsory at early years. But actually what you've just done is linked all those aspects together and shown actually that we all need to be working together, because it's an unhelpful separation at the moment between academic and vocation, etc. But there's been lots of comments coming in, mainly people really enjoying, points you're making about stop clarifying curriculum for excellence, etc. So I'm going to pick up a couple of these. The first one was somebody saying that there's such a complex range of qualifications at the moment. It's really difficult to understand what qualification now actually means. And are they just simply hankering for the simplicity of O grades and higher? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I completely get that. I worry about. I worried when the reforms were happening back in the late 90s, and we were starting to use terms that weren't really very transparent, particularly for parents. I thought, not just for pupils, but for parents as well. I mean, higher still, for example, always seemed to me to be a really weird description of anything. I hope there's not somebody on the call here who invented the term higher still. But they, I think parents and pupils and employers being able to understand what qualifications mean is really important. And I think we started off when we initially were talking about curriculum for excellence back sort of 15 years ago. We were talking about flexibility around about qualifications at S4, S5, stretching qualifications at S6 and so on. And I think initially that the idea was still to have qualifications that were very clear and very demanding, but for some people who were able to do them more quickly, others perhaps to take longer to secure them. And again, I think that was the initial plan for the new national qualifications. But I really haven't encountered any evidence that that is what people are experiencing.
Would an overarching certificate or baccalaureate style qualification help to bring these different types of learning together and maybe offer young people a broader curriculum and range of experiences?
I think it might, but I don't think it. I think if it was done as just a straight add-on to the current system, it doesn't really help. I think if Scotland was going to go down that route, then it needs to be embedded as part of the system, not as just a sort of add-on replacement for a system that people don't feel is currently achieving what they want it to achieve. And I do think there's a really critical element here. It is important that we we provide opportunities to stretch people whose educational attainment is moving faster than others. But it's also critically important that we provide challenging opportunities to secure attainment qualifications for those who are further behind or are making less progress. All the evidence, in my opinion, shows that that if with the right teaching and the right motivation, the right encouragement, young people, wherever they are in the sort of attainment ladder, can be pushed to drive further and harder. And I do think clarity around qualifications is important, and I don't think there is the sort of understanding of the new system. Even now, what's that now? 6 years on, I don't think we've got that sort of level of understanding of the new system as it currently is, that was there under the old system, and that is not helpful for pupils, for parents, or for employers.
So thank you very much. I mean, there are also other comments in the chat, as you can see, of people questioning whether a level playing field is actually ever achievable. But I want to move on to someone who says, actually reporting from a local level, this person is saying, I've never seen such close working relationships between schools, learning communities, parents and pupils to help families. But the provocative statement there is HMIE could disappear tomorrow and no one would miss it. So you are calling for an independent inspectorate that would push for things like achievement and attainment. So I just wondered how you felt about this, well, it can disappear tomorrow and actually no one would miss it.
Well, I think that's a pretty, if that's true, or if that's anybody's perception, that is that should worry those currently responsible for the inspectorate, from ministers through to the heads of Education Scotland and beyond. That's not the impression that I have talking to teachers, that people wouldn't miss it. But I think there is I sense a deep frustration amongst teachers that that the inspectorate is not driving support and the sort of improvement and change that is required, that it's not perceived as being independent of government. And I think that's, to me, I just think that's fundamentally wrong. I believe that as Education Minister, despite the fact that it made life uncomfortable for me at times, that we needed an inspectorate that was independent, an inspectorate that would accept and understand the policy framework that was being set out by government, but go out and assess the delivery of that completely independently of government, and occasionally give us tough messages about what we needed to change or improve, as well as give those tough messages to schools, and occasionally praise and report independently that things were working well. And I learned so much from the work of the inspectorate. When Graham Donaldson was chief inspector, by which point I was First Minister, not Education Minister anymore, I learned so much from the work of the inspectorate at that time, good and bad, about what was happening in Scotland schools. And in fact, in many ways, the reservations that Peter Peacock and I had about the way in which Curriculum for Excellence might be heading in 2006, 2007, had come from that feedback. So I think having an independent inspectorate is absolutely vital. And I think all the best education systems in the world, in my experience, have some provision like that. And we used to lead the world in that. And I think if we're going to strive to be back as world beaters again, then we need to return to that sort of function.
Thank you, Jack. There's also a caution to us tonight to be careful about a narrative that Curriculum for Excellence has failed. And one of the reasons was suggested could be that the vision for CFE was damaged by a government that's been frightened by pushback from schools who had not been helped to understand it well enough. And actually that the most recent OECD data put Scottish pupils in top 4, in fact, ahead, I think, on things like global competencies, attitudes to immigrants, I think learning about culture, also interest in global issues. So is the issue here about not so much a reverse, but a renewing of actually curriculum for excellence principles and capacities?
Well, I don't think we should abandon the idea of a curriculum for excellence, because the whole idea of a curriculum for excellence was to have excellence. It was to have excellence at all levels of the system, and to understand that to achieve excellence, you had to continuously improve. So I don't think we should abandon the idea of a curriculum for excellence. I think the problem has been, or is, whether or not the current curriculum for excellence is indeed a curriculum for excellence. And while, yes, there are certain global competencies in which Scottish pupils appear to be doing better than some others, I think when it comes to many of the basic competencies that are required for knowledge and understanding, then that is definitely not the case. So, you know, I think that we, and on the issue of where the pushback came from, I don't think the problem was in schools. I never thought the problem was in schools. Schools are places where people feel under pressure. Head teachers and teachers feel stressed and challenged. I understand that. And they need to be encouraged and supported in driving improvements, to look beyond the day-to-day management of the classroom and the management of the school, to look ahead and to implement and progress improvements. I think the problem with curriculum for excellence was not in the schools. It was at the national level in Scotland, where I think those who were determining the curriculum, I think, lost a sense of direction and an absolute commitment to excellence that had initially driven the concept. And I think that's where we need to, and what we need to inject back into the national leadership on this, because local leadership is absolutely vital and local management is absolutely vital, but without strong national leadership, then I think you lose out on that drive to excellence at all levels of the system.
So I wanted to maybe go back to, I mean, the few times I had the opportunity to work with Peter Peacock, I certainly found him to be someone who did have vision, great vision at times, and a superb way of communicating that to people, and a good understanding of the different facets, like from community work to schools to formal, informal education and so forth. Could you maybe say a bit more about your concerns, but also Peter Peacock's concerns about the way curriculum for excellence was heading in that 2006-07 period that you were talking about earlier?
Well, our concern was the concept of curriculum for excellence was to find a way of bridging what had been a dilemma in Scotland for quite a long time between the local responsibility for agreeing the detail of a curriculum and the need for national policies on the curriculum and in other areas that set out a sense of direction for the country as a whole. And that had always been a bit of a challenge, including a political challenge in Scotland, between the role of the local authorities and the schools themselves and the role of national government. And it was certainly my view that, particularly after devolution in 1999, that and therefore these decisions not being made by a UK-wide government, but specifically by a Scottish government, elected and accountable in Scotland alone, that there was a need for greater clarity at a national level on what was expected in the curriculum, and that at the core of that should be a determination to strive for excellence at all levels, whether it was at the the most advanced educational attainment level, or whether it was for those who were further behind. And so the concept of excellence was not at that time to create a kind of a more vague idea of what education would be in Scotland, that would see innovation in a not innovation in a sense that did not promote the gaining of specific knowledge. It was to ensure that everybody had the opportunity to be stretched as far as possible within a wider context of understanding the society in which we live. And I think we felt at that time that the curriculum for excellence was going to move towards the sort of 20,000 pages of guidance that eventually transpired. That there was a kind of muddying of the waters. There was a lack of connection with what parents and pupils needed and desired, and we could just feel at that time that the momentum and the level of aspiration and ambition was dropping, and that was why we were going to review it at that time. We felt it needed an injection of energy, but also an injection of aspiration that was missing.
I mean, there's certainly people agreeing with the fact that we shouldn't limit what knowledge is and how what we mean by knowledge, and there's a question of, so do we still continue to overvalue traditional academic attainment and undervalue technical, caring, artistic achievement, whose value, of course, has been highlighted during the pandemic. And of course, there's all this protest at the moment, and it's been ongoing, about the lack of money to provide music, for example, in school and so forth. So,
well, I mean, I absolutely 100% support, for example, the provision of music tuition in schools. We introduced the National Initiative on Music Tuition in primary schools when I was Education Minister. It was an absolute success. I think the fact that it's been a battleground over recent years and has declined is deeply unfortunate. There's lots of empirical evidence as well as anecdotal evidence that artistic, creative activities, including music tuition, make a real difference to kids, particularly kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think that should be a fundamental part of our system. But let me just pick on music tuition as an example. I mean, yeah, some people will pick up the ability to play a musical instrument by instinct. There are some people who have that talent instinctively and can learn by listening to music, what they need to do on an instrument to make it work properly. But most people, in order to play a musical instrument, need to learn the basics of reading music and understanding music and form and so on. And we don't dismiss that when we're teaching music. Music tuition doesn't dismiss the requirement to have a basic knowledge in order to then advance and be better as a musical practitioner and be more creative and so on. So why do we make that same mistake in other parts of education? People need basic knowledge in order to analyse, to learn and develop, and I think that's what's the lack of understanding that, I think, is a real problem in the system. I think if people are going to be able to develop the sort of life skills that I think those who support the current curriculum for excellence say are so critically important. In order to achieve that, you have to have a basic level of knowledge and understanding about the world, about history, about and you need to have a basic level of literacy and numeracy. And I think the balance has gone wrong, and that's why I think basic knowledge is so important.
Thank you. I'm going to take us back to HMI. There's a question here, which I think is an astute one about, in normal times, HMI commits most of its resource to inspecting schools. This would make sense if the problem is one of implementation. But if the one is mainly a failure of policy, how would you suggest we redirect HMI energies to tackling this?
Well, I think if you need to have the right mindset at the top. So the political leadership and the leadership of the agencies and so on need to have the right mindset. Otherwise, very, very little can change. But at the same time, if you have an independent inspectorate, I mean, not everything hangs on an independent inspectorate, and there are other bodies in Scotland that are currently in worse shape than the inspectorate that need change. But if you have an independent inspectorate, then that inspectorate not only advises schools and reports on schools, but can also advise government and do so with a degree of independence and authority that isn't possible when it's more under the wing. And I think if you go back to the way that the inspectorate conducted its business in the 1990s and compare that to the impact that it was having 15 years ago, let's say, then you can see the benefit of having an independent inspectorate that speaks truth to government as well as speaks truth to schools. And I think that's lost. I mean, every single teacher I've spoken to in preparation for this lecture has said that there is a lack of confidence in the inspectorate as a body that will basically stretch schools and speak truth to government. And I think that's a serious problem.
Mm-hmm. We're about 5 minutes left of this Q&A, and I want to move us into looking a little bit at a slightly different topic, that is the issue of senior phase. In my introduction, I said that senior phase was perhaps an afterthought, and its link to BGE has therefore been quite muddy. And there has been, of course, some excellent local innovations with senior phase, but equally there have been, I think, poorer versions of that. So how do we tackle this and enable schools to embrace the opportunities of creating curricular offerings that meet the local needs for all their pupils?
Well, I have deliberately focused my attention on schools on this because I wanted to make these points strongly. But I do believe that, and I would describe it as post-14, not necessarily post-16. I think beyond the age of 14, there needs to be much more flexibility than is even possible these days between schools, colleges, and that link into universities and higher education as well. I think we need a more flexible approach to education. I believe by 2007, I had come to a very strong conclusion for myself that I believed that we should raise the formal legal age of leaving education and training to 18. I still believe that would have been the right thing to do. I think international comparisons show that that's important, but also it would have given a very strong signal throughout the whole system. But underneath that age of 18, I think we need to have a much a more flexible system to allow people to make progress at different stages. People are developing. Young people, teenagers, are developing in different ways in these ages. I often tell the story about the boy that sat next to me in my maths class at school. I mean, I was a top maths student at my school, and I went on to do a maths degree and become a maths teacher. But the boy that sat next to me struggled in fifth year. He was what we called a February birthday. He was one of the younger kids in the class, and he was a bit behind. The year that I passed my maths higher, with close on to, I think, maybe even close to 100%, he struggled and he failed. He failed the maths higher. And what was always interesting for me was that he went back to school. He did it again the following year. I ended up with a general maths degree from the University of Stirling, where My performance was not exactly outstanding. He ended up not only with an honours maths degree, but with a master's, with an MSc in maths and physics from the University of Manchester. He went much further than me with the subject, despite the fact that I had been helping him in the classroom, and he at that time had been failing. And I think we need to recognise that people develop at different times and in different ways. And so I think a flexibility between 14 and 18 is really critical. And it should not be beyond our wit, particularly with the use of flexible use of technology, to make it possible for young people to benefit from sitting exams at different times and doing different kinds of qualifications, but doing different kinds of things as well as part of a wider approach to education and training between the ages of 14 and 18.
There's certainly agreement with you from some of the audience that yes, post 14 is really important, and that just talking about 5th or 6th year isn't good enough. But there's also the other side, which is start them a bit older at the other stage, in the early years side. So it's quite a span there. There is also the inevitable tensions between the reality and the accuracy of PISA and OECD, and being overly reliant on OECD versus the, hey, we need comparative data. So where are we going to get it if we don't partake in these kinds of frameworks? But I want to actually, as we close, ask you, because knowledge is one that lots of people have talked about this evening, whether it's a caution to us about not having limited knowledge or having the right kind of knowledge. So the question of knowledge is a key topic for people in the audience. Are we suggesting that we've lost the Scottish trait of liberal education for all?
No, Curriculum for Excellence was about creating that maximum degree of opportunity and to some extent aspiration for all. At the very beginning, and I think the problem here is the relationship between knowledge and analysis, and I think we're trying to teach knowledge by starting with analysis, and a wider perspective, and I think we've got that the wrong way around. I think for people to develop life skills, to develop the ability to analyse, to think for themselves and so on, they need basic degrees of knowledge and basic skills to move on to that platform. And I don't think you learn basic skills and basic knowledge through the exploration of your own ideas. I think we've got that. I think we've got that the wrong way around. And I think that's probably the core problem.
Yeah, and I think that, there's also a caution this evening about being overly parochial as well. So we do need to look wider and internationally. There has also been an endorsement of your call for returning back to having longitudinal data and stats, because data is really, really important in order to be able to measure and look at progress. But also a point that, as you, in fact, chiming with your last point, that curriculum not based on knowledge may well widen inequalities. So on that basis, I think we need to give you a rest now. I would like to thank everybody who's actually put things on chat, and I'm really sorry if I haven't picked up your points. I've tried to kind of scan them and picked as many as I could, but you have been a tour de force of everybody's gripes and concerns and anxieties and questions. So I'd like to thank you very much, Lord McConnell, for a very stimulating evening, and pass back to Professor Peter Matheson.
Thank you very much, Rowena. We can't really do rounds of applause, but thank you very much for the presentation, Lord McConnell. My task now is just to close by saying a few thank yous, and I'll say thank you to Lord McConnell himself in a moment. But before that, a few other thank yous. Thank you very much to the Wraith family for joining us this evening and for the memory of David Wraith and the legacy that he leaves. And I know that some of his former colleagues are also on the call, so thank you to all of them for being here. I'd like to echo Lord McConnell's words about thanking teachers everywhere, primary, secondary and tertiary teachers all across the world. I mean, these are people who give of themselves in order to improve the lot of the next generation. And I don't think there can be any greater call to arms than that. So I absolutely agree with those words. I'd like to thank all the organisers of this evening's event in Murray House School for Education and Sport, all the audience for being here and for contributing to quite a robust set of conversations on the text screen with some differences of opinion there, and that's always good to see in any kind of university setting. So thank you to everybody for participating. Most of all to Lord McConnell himself. Jack, thank you so much for your passion and your commitment to education. Thank you for sharing it with us this evening. I really enjoyed the anecdote about the boy that used to sit next to you in class. I started off feeling sorry for him, and then after that I didn't feel sorry for him anymore, because he told me that actually he came out on top in mathematical terms. So a great example of the power of education to transform lives, and the fact that you can't have one size to fit all. I think that's a really telling story, as well as illustrating your own ability to be self-effacing about your own achievements. But anyway, thank you very much for that presentation. Thank you to Rowena for chairing both the talk and also the Q&A. And I wish you all a very pleasant evening. And I hope that on future occasions we can meet face-to-face rather than through these digital formats. But as these things go, that was a very successful event, and I'm grateful to everybody that's participated. With that, thank you all very much and have a great evening.
Thank you.